A disaster. Not only would Heidegger have seen this book as a disaster, but also the fact that you are reading it. Even though it was about him, this would not have mitigated its deplorableness. Presumably you should have gone to the original German for enlightenment. There you could have come face to face with a genuine article. Our analysis of the worldhood of the world has constantly been bringing the whole phenomenon of being in the world into view, although its constitutive items have not all stood out with the same phenomenal distinctness as the phenomena of the world itself. Or, to put it with more deceptive transparency, when we think of being, we arrive at our real home. In the early 1930s, the world was plunged into the Great Depression. Germany's fragile economic recovery collapsed once more. An embittered nation turned to extremes. In April 1933, Hitler and the Nazis came to power. One of the first moves of the Nazi government was to purge the civil service of all Jews. In Germany, the universities are part of the civil service. The effect was catastrophic. One example will suffice. The mathematics department at Göttingen, regarded at the time as the world's finest, was led by the aging David Hilbert, one of the greatest mathematicians of his age. When asked by a visiting Nazi minister what he thought of his new, Germanized mathematics department, Hilbert simply replied, "There is no mathematics department." When even academia was not spared, other realms of society could expect far, far worse. The suicides, and those Jews fortunate enough to flee the country, leaving behind all they possessed, would come to be regarded as the lucky ones. In May 1933, Heidegger accepted the appointment as rector of Freiburg University, an appointment that required him to become a member of the Nazi Party. But this was more than just a case of overweening ambition leading him into dangerous waters. He quickly made his views clear in his own inimitable style. The will to the essence of the German university is the will to science as will to the historical mission of the German people as a people that knows itself in its state. Insofar as this statement means anything at all, such will to science had become a very sorry affair. Germany's great achievements in relativity and nuclear physics, the work of Einstein, Heisenberg, who was not Jewish, and other German Nobel Prize winners, was now dismissed as Jewish science. Hannah Arendt wrote to Heidegger, unable to believe what she had heard about her revered philosophic mentor. Heidegger wrote back to her, denying any anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, he severed all relations with Husserl, who was Jewish, and in consequence was dropped as Professor Emeritus. Heidegger would also quietly remove the dedication to Husserl from the 4th edition of Being and Time. Such actions may be indefensible, but do they compromise Heidegger's philosophy? Many commentators, who nonetheless abhor his actions, remain convinced that his behavior here does not affect his philosophy. On the other hand, it seems undeniable that elements of Heidegger's philosophy lead to conclusions that have recognizable echoes in the beliefs of German triumphalism. Take, for instance, his ideas on the language necessary for genuine philosophizing. It may come as a surprise that someone possessed of Heidegger's way with language had very clear views about its proper use. He was convinced that living philosophy could only be conducted in living language. Latin was a dead language, but its death had affected almost all European languages, Italian, French, Spanish, English. All these derived from the dead language of Latin. This dead language led to dead thinking. Thought in such languages was diverted from the wellspring of being. Just one language remained unaffected by this: German. Only the German language had a direct link going back to ancient Greek, which was the primordial language, the original language from which other European languages derived. Thus, proper philosophical thinking could only be done in German. This gave the German people a special destiny. Only from the Germans can world historical meditation come, provided that they find and defend what is German. When Heidegger joined the Nazi Party, this was more than just careerism. I saw in the movement that had gained power, the Nazis, the possibility of an inner recollection and renewal of the people, and a path that would allow it to discover its historical vocation in the Western world. There is no doubt that his philosophical thinking had led him to this. His rejection of the modern in favour of the folkish element of German culture accorded with similar, if more insidious, Nazi ideas about the pure German Volk, folk. On the other hand, how he squared his abhorrence of mass culture with the behaviour at the Nazi Nuremberg rallies quite simply defies plausible explanation. There were, it seems, two types of mass culture: true German culture and debased modern American culture. Living in his ivory tower, or cosy alpine hut, Heidegger seems to have had little awareness of the full consequences of what he was doing, as well as a considerable amount of wishful thinking. Both the philosopher and his philosophy appear to have favoured bracketing out certain aspects of reality. This is the dangerous and self-delusory aspect of his philosophy that led him to support German resurgence. His philosophy as such does not include Nazi ideas. Further evidence of this self-delusory attitude is seen in Heidegger's dealings with Hannah Arendt. In the same letter that he wrote to her defending himself against the charge of anti-Semitism, he also appeared to attempt a justification of his anti-Semitism. No matter what he was said to have done, he wrote, this did not affect his personal relationships with Jews, such as herself and Husserl. His dealings with Husserl were a tragic farce. At the same time he was forced to dismiss his old friend, he ensured that his wife sent Husserl flowers and a consoling note. Yet even Heidegger soon found it difficult to maintain such obfuscation. What could be achieved in prose was not quite so easy in life. In his opening address as rector, he had spoken of his hopes for the future. In the words of his biographer, Safransky, he wished for a return of the Greek world in the social life of the Revolution as the restoration of the original power of the awakening of Greek philosophy. But the power and the philosophy were now becoming increasingly divergent. His rectorship carried him into ever more perilous moral waters as he sought to implement the latest directives from the Nazi Ministry of Education. Only when he retreated to his alpine chalet at Todtnauburg in the Black Forest could he remain close to his Greek dream. Below, in Freiburg, Nazi thugs roamed the campus. For a while he clung to the belief that all great things outlast the storm. Then, less than a year after his appointment as rector of his old university, he abruptly resigned. During the following months, there were a number of insulting references to him in Nazi magazines, but there was no danger of him losing his post as professor of philosophy. He remained a member of the party. At one stage, there was even talk of him being appointed director of the Prussian Academy of Professors, but he was glad when this fell through. It would have meant him moving to Berlin. He remained very much a philosopher who was rooted to place, constantly fulminating against powerless and bottomless thinking. Again, according to Safransky, Heidegger's faith in Hitler and the need for revolution was unbroken. Even so, he gradually began to distance himself from politics. His philosophy had sought a hero, and it had been a political hero, but now he was once more separating the spheres. Philosophy was deeper than politics. Being was the driving spirit of events, but it did not have to become absorbed in them. As was so often the case, it became increasingly difficult to distinguish between being in general and Heidegger's individual being. With the approach of the inevitable war, he gradually withdrew into himself. As the darkness of war descended, philosophy, as a structure of culture, became all but superfluous, surviving only as a being addressed by being itself. Even so, in the midst of World War II, he was still willing to make pronouncements. Today we know that the Anglo-Saxon world of Americanism is determined to destroy Europe, and thus our homeland, and thus the origin of the Occidental. Everything had to be seen in terms of destiny. Aggrandizement justified all. Heidegger's own personal being became being with a capital B. Germany's fate became the fate of Western civilization, no less. The fact that France, Britain, by then much of Italy, and even his beloved Greece were fighting alongside the Americans who included soldiers descended from all European nations and were led by a man with the unmistakably German name of Eisenhower, does not seem to have occurred to him. Only Germany could now apparently lay claim to the origin of the Occidental. 1945 left Germany and all such thinking in ruins. Heidegger was stripped of his post at the university. Meanwhile his house, together with his precious library, were requisitioned in the service of all Jews. In Germany the universities are part of the civil service. The effect was catastrophic. One example will suffice. The mathematics department at Göttingen, regarded at the time as the world's finest, was led by the aging David Hilbert, one of the greatest mathematicians of his age. When asked by a visiting Nazi minister what he thought of his new, Germanized mathematics department, Hilbert simply replied, "There is no mathematics department." When even academia was not spared, other realms of society could expect far, far worse. The suicides, and those Jews fortunate enough to flee the country, leaving behind all they possessed. Analysis of the worldhood of the world has constantly been bringing the whole phenomenon of being in the world into view, although its constitutive items have not all stood out with the same phenomenal distinctness as the phenomena of the world itself. Or, to put it with more deceptive transparency, when we think of being, we arrive at our real home. In the early 1930s, the world was plunged into the Great Depression. Germany's fragile economic recovery collapsed once more. An embittered nation turned to extremes. In April 1933, Hitler and the Nazis came to power. One of the first moves of the Nazi government was to purge the civil service. A disaster! Not only would Heidegger have seen this book as a disaster, but also the fact that you are reading it. Even though it was about him, this would not have mitigated its deplorableness. Presumably you should have gone to the original German for enlightenment. There you could have come face to face with a genuine article. Our